Good day, and welcome to the Brigham and Women's Pastors Roundtable discussing the COVID-19 vaccine. With the availability of the vaccine, the race is on to limit the spread of the virus and save lives. While many people are excited about taking the vaccine, many are also fearful and reluctant because they have questions and concerns that they feel still have not been addressed. Statistics show us that the Black and Latino communities are the most hesitant. The goal of this roundtable is to address those concerns. We have asked pastors of our biggest churches in the Black and Latino communities in Boston to bring forth the questions and concerns that they hear every day from their congregations and ask those tough questions to the medical doctors and experts at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. This roundtable is designed to be an honest discussion so people can make informed decisions about their health and the health of their families. On the pastor's side, we have Dr. Roberto Miranda, senior pastor of the largest predominantly Latino church in Boston, Lion of Judah Church, and leader of all of the Latino churches in Massachusetts. And Dr. David Wright, executive director of the Black Ministerial Alliance and assistant pastor at the famed People's Baptist Church in Boston. With Brigham and Women's Hospital, we have Dr. Lindsay Baden, Dr. Paulette Chandler, and Wanda McLean. And Wanda will be extending more formal introductions in just 1 minute. But now, your host, Reverend Basil Yard.
I am Basil Yard, senior pastor of the Final Thrust Ministries in Brockton and director of church relations for Salem Media Boston. The questions and concerns expressed by us pastors are those we hear expressed in our communities, and we ourselves have questions and concerns that need to be answered. I now introduce to you Wanda McLean, Vice President, Community Health and Health Equity and Brigham Health. And Wanda will introduce the Brigham team of doctors.
Thank you, Pastor Yard, and thank you all for having us with you today. As Pastor Yard said, I'm Wanda McLean, and I have been working with the two doctors who I have the pleasure of introducing since this pandemic arose. And they have been at the forefront of educating me and other members of our team and community about the role that we can play in combating the disease. I myself have been involved in community-based COVID testing with members of my staff, and also meeting the social needs of our community and hearing their questions and hearing their hesitancy. Also hearing that within our employee population. So today I'm so thrilled to be able to introduce Dr. Paulette Chandler. Dr. Chandler is Associate Epidemiologist in the Division of Preventive Medicine and a primary care physician at Brigham and Women's Hospital. She serves as the lead for community engagement and education for the COVID-19 vaccine trials at Brigham and Women's Hospital. And I'm also thrilled to introduce Dr. Lindsay Baden, an infectious disease expert at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Dr. Baden is the co-principal investigator on the Moderna phase 3 vaccine trial and has been a leader in vaccine education and has done, along with Dr. Chandler, many community forums. We are all here to hear the issues that have come forth from your congregation and from you, and to do our best to have a good conversation to address those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Wanda. And if you are listening or if you are viewing this roundtable discussion, I want to encourage you to stay with us for the full hour. Your questions are going to be answered, I promise you. You are going to, at the end of this hour, be in a much better position to make a decision as to whether or not you should take the vaccine. I want to start with Dr. Roberto Miranda this evening to ask his first question.
Thank you, Basil. I'm delighted and honored to be with all of you tonight, and especially to know that these listeners are going to be, I believe, well informed about some of the basic aspects of this process of the vaccine. I'd like to start with just a very simple question, just to get us into the topic more fully. It is regarding the vaccine itself. And doctors, would you just quickly tell us how does the vaccine work? I mean, in other words, just from a medical biological point of view, what exactly is going on so that we can understand better just that piece of the whole thing?
Thank you, Dr. Yardi, for hosting this event and guiding the discussion. Dr. Miranda, your question is a terrific first question, which is, what does the vaccine do? Why should we be interested in it? And I think that's something we should think about vaccines in general. What vaccines do is they educate the immune system, and they educate the immune system without the real infection happening. Because that's what happens when we get a real infection. There are lots of viruses or bacteria in our body, and they make us very sick. What we try to do with the vaccine is take a piece of it so that you can't get the infection. There is no infection there, but just a piece of it that is most important for the immune system to recognize, so that if you ever see the virus, your immune system already knows what to do so you don't get sick. And so it's really taking the immune system to school is the way I think about what a vaccine is.
Now, I think a good follow-up question to that, Dr. Baden, a question that expresses great concerns within the communities, and particularly in the church communities, is what's actually in the vaccine, in this vaccine. There are a lot of theories out there, good and bad, and people are concerned about this. Could you and Dr. Chandler address this for us?
What's in the vaccine, and each vaccine you have to look at individually because each one has its own recipe, if we can think of it that way. And the key piece of the vaccine is the mRNA vaccine's messenger RNA. That is sort of a new concept, and so it makes us all step back a little bit and say, what is this? And DNA and RNA sort of make up who we are. What science has been able to do is to take a little piece of RNA, something that is very transient in the body. It only lasts hours. It's not something long-lived. And have that very small piece represent the spike protein, or a key part of the virus that the virus needs to cause infection, and takes a piece of RNA to allow the body to make an immune response against the virus. That's the key piece. And it's very transient. It's not stable. It doesn't stay in the body very long. It's hours, days. Then the other part of what's in the vaccine is how do we get it to the immune system? And that's where something called a lipid, which is like fat, cholesterol, fat, things that are in our body anyway. And if you put it in a certain composition, it gets it right to the right cells, the immune system, so that it can recognize that piece of RNA or the piece of the virus so that it can develop an immune response. So it's actually a very simple recipe with very few components. It's this component that helps with understanding the virus, and a component of lipid or fats or cholesterol that get it to the right place. And so that's pretty much what's in the vaccine. It only stays in the body, as I said, days, and is cleared pretty quickly. But in that short amount of time, it takes the immune system to school, as I said.
Dr. Chandler, a question for you, please. There's a lot of concern in the community regarding the speed with which this vaccine has been developed. And of course, it's understandable. I mean, it's been an urgent situation that we're facing, hundreds of thousands of deaths and so on and so forth. And so, this is unprecedented, the quickness of this whole process, which has its huge advantages, but also has its disadvantages, such as not allowing the usual number of people to be tested, or the animal testing and so on and so forth. As I understand, I may be incorrect here, but it has not been approved by the FDA because it hasn't followed the regular process. But nevertheless, I mean, doctors believe that yes, all the due diligence has been done and so on. But there's a lot of concern among people that this is not something that has been something as weighty as this hasn't been vetted and researched long enough and well enough for us to engage in it with all kinds of reassurance. So would you speak to that, please?
So there are multiple pieces that go into vaccine development, and this vaccine has been developed on the foundation of prior research. So we were able to take it, or the researchers were able to take advantage of the prior research on messenger RNA platform. Collaboration occurred around the globe. When it was sequenced in China, they immediately, shared that information. Different phases of the clinical trials were compressed and overlapping, and then large-scale trials were conducted simultaneously, meaning that these clinical trials, involved 30, 40,000 people. There haven't been these type of large clinical trials for a vaccine, and there's never been this type of these large clinical trials that were done so rapidly. And the other thing is the infection, the organisms was so rampant in the community that it allowed for rapid accrual of number of people that were exposed to the vaccine. And I'll let Lindsay tag on to, add some additional information. In terms of the FDA approval, FDA emergency use authorization, it was a very rigorous process. The usual process of review of complications, review of endpoints, those standards were upheld during this development and assessment of the efficacy of the vaccine.
Thank you.
Dr. Chandler has all the right concepts. I mean, this was done with great care, but done quickly because the amount of infection around us. And Dr. Miranda, as you mentioned, we have had millions infected in this country and hundreds of thousands who have died already, with numbers just skyrocketing every day. And that sadly allowed the studies to be conducted faster than usual because of the amount of infection in the community. But as Dr. Chandler said, the rigorous review of safety occurred. The Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is a board that oversees safety, is independent of the study and everyone else, impaneled by the NIH, did its periodic reviews very carefully. The FDA and their independent VRBPAC committee did their thorough review of all the data. The CDC and their ACIP committee, which also reviews, did their independent reviews. So multiple layers of independent review done in open for community input, community vetting, community discussion has occurred. And I think that that type of transparency, that type of independent review that requires full and complete data by statute, not just a good idea, I think is very reassuring that a lot of different groups have looked at this to make sure that it makes sense and that the safety and the efficacy are what people say they are and what they think they are. And then there's peer review in the medical literature and many academics who look at the data and then discuss it. So lots of discussion and review have been going on. Of course, more discussion, more review is welcome for all of us to better understand the nuances of the data, and as more of us get vaccinated, to make sure that the safety is continually vigorously overseen, which is ongoing both by the CDC and the FDA.
One last aspect of that question is, please speak to us regarding the whole issue of adverse effects. I mean, reactions of people. There have been talks, and reports of people dying, which I suspect is part of a normal process involving millions of people potentially. But just reassure us with regard to adverse effects, unforeseen situations that may crop up, deaths, and so on and so forth. I think that would be very reassuring to the listeners as well.
Paulette?
Yeah, well, so far we haven't had large numbers of unexpected deaths, and millions of people have been vaccinated so far. So the data that we had from the trial is confirmed by what we're seeing as people are being vaccinated. And that's reassuring that the data that we collected in the trials is playing out. It's confirmed by what we're seeing as people are being vaccinated across the US and across the world.
Absolutely. No serious side effects like death or other patterns have been seen, but there are side effects, and we need to realize that. And what we have seen with the vaccine, like we see with the flu shot or the shingles shot, that your arm can hurt for a day, and some people may develop a little bit of fever or a little bit of fatigue for a day or two after the vaccination, maybe a little bit more after the second vaccination than the first vaccination, but it goes away without any side effects, doesn't come back. And so there are side effects, but those seem relatively mild compared to the seriousness of COVID illness, which sadly Dr. Chandler and I see too much in our clinic and in the hospital.
And now I want to ask a question. It might be a two-tier question, and it might take us back to what's in the vaccine. But I have seen videos, at least 5 videos that were done by doctors and some who are doctors doing research in the making of vaccines. And these doctors are saying, do not take the vaccine. One of the main things that they are purporting is that there is something in the vaccine that will change the DNA of people who take it over the long term. And this is meant to control people over the long term. I would like for you to speak to that, and also to speak to a number of videos that I've also seen, 3 of them, where people, one, the wife of a doctor in I think it's called radiology, very healthy 50-year-old man who died after taking the vaccine. I've seen a number of these videos purporting to that people died after taking the vaccine. I know those are 2 questions, but there are 2 questions that are circling out there. They've been seen by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And I think that this needs to be answered.
Well, in terms of, I've seen those videos too. People have sent them to me. And it's important to recognize that, one, backdrop, we have 3,000 to 4,000 deaths a day from COVID-19. That's our death rate. Over 400,000 people have died in the US. Now, for those videos that said they got the COVID vaccine and they died, I cannot say for certainty that it was the COVID vaccine that caused their death, because people have a host of medical problems that could cause death independent of a COVID vaccine. 2, in terms of it changing the DNA, it's a messenger RNA vaccine. So it's messenger RNA, which means it enters the cell is able to make the protein, the spike protein that, allows that virus to enter the cell. Well, it makes the spike protein, which allows the body to make antibodies, which prevent the virus from infecting the cell. So messenger RNA cannot enter the nucleus, which is the headquarters of the cell. So there's no involvement of DNA with the entry of the vaccine, vaccine material, that messenger RNA, into the cell. And then the messenger RNA is broken down, degraded. So no DNA alteration. But many people have asked me that question. They send me the videos, and then I end up sending them the videos to show how messenger RNA interacts with the cell. It just stays in the outside of the nucleus. The cell makes the protein for the spike protein, and then that messenger RNA is broken down.
I'm not sure how to formulate this question, but I just want to build up on that and completely eradicate that concern that Basil has mentioned, if you can. We live in a conspiracy theory-oriented universe these days. And so there's always this fear that there's some nefarious group of individuals behind closed doors manipulating things and saying that this is the way things work. But then in reality, there's another reality that is, intervening there, and decisions are being made and things are being injected into substances and so on and so forth. Maybe what I'm trying to say, it would be reassuring, I think, to many listeners in terms of how you understand that process of development of that vaccine, the actual production of the substance, the bottling of it, or whatever is the packaging of it, and so on and so forth. I mean, can you tell us a little bit that would render completely ineffective that concern? Just the whole process itself of how this thing works. And I know that may be outside of your specialty, but maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
And Dr. Miranda, can I add to that, please? As you're answering that, one of the questions I hear is not so much that there's a conspiracy about what the long-term impacts will be, but that people just don't know what they'll be. How do you address the question of, well, they hasn't been around long enough for us to know that in 10 years, I won't grow an extra head or something silly like that. But if you could address what, how you give comfort to people who are concerned that they just don't know what the long-term impact would be, I'd appreciate that.
Yes.
I mean, when I'm discussing with my patients, when they express concerns about the long-term impacts, I highlight that we don't know the long-term impacts because it hasn't been around long enough. We do know that most vaccines, when they do have, harmful side effects, usually it appears within the first couple of months of the administration, and we have not seen, horrendous side effects with the vaccine, other than, soreness at the site, fever, headaches, chills, fatigue. Those are the main symptoms that people express. Now, in terms of the long-term side effects, no, we do not know. But we also know that we have 3,000 to 4,000 deaths a day. And we also know that when people are infected with this virus, they can have long-term damaging effects from the virus. I mean, I have patients, they're still short of breath. They had the infection months ago. They're still walking around with oxygen. Others still have fatigue. They have muscle weakness. They have mental fog. They have not been able to go back to work. There's a new disability code for COVID-19 infection for people that aren't able to work. So when you weigh those risks and benefits of getting the infection versus taking a vaccine to prevent the infection, it becomes quite stark. I mean, I can tell you one lady, she calls, she said, I've been doing this eucalyptus oil, the onion, the garlic, and the lemon, the lime. I've been drinking that every day. I wear my N95, I double mask, I wear my face shield, my gloves, and guess what? I got COVID-19. And now I've got COVID pneumonia. How did I get it? I'm doing everything. And the vaccine was offered to me, but I declined it. So now she's been out of work for a few weeks. And who knows when she'll get back with the underlying lung issues that she's developed. So that's what you have to weigh when you think about, okay, I don't know the long-term side effects. We don't. But I also don't know, I don't like the long-term side effects of getting COVID infection either. So it's, it's a balance. And you have to weigh the benefits, the costs, the risk when you think about a new vaccine like this.
Now, one of the concerns particularly among the church people or Bible-believing people, has to do with their belief system or their worldview. And I want to ask Dr. Miranda to express the concerns that he has put forth previously to us so that they can be properly addressed. Dr. Miranda, would you do that?
Sure, Basil. And I think because of the delicate nature of the question, and I do realize that I may be taking you out of your own sense of expertise, so please feel free to, clarify. I wrote out a question here. It's a little lengthier than I'd like it to be, but just to present it in a dignified sort of way. Fundamentalists and Pentecostal believers, especially, move and live within a secular culture that they often perceive as hostile and conspiratorial. And these conservative Christians are often steeped in a religious mentality that includes the imminent second coming of Jesus, the coming of the Antichrist, a one world government, and the persecution of Christians who don't conform to a secular, what they perceive as a secular anti-Christian agenda. And at least from this kind of perspective of these conservative believers, some of the major cultural and political events of these recent months and years here in America, they fit quite well into the script of what the scriptures, as they read it, predict for, it's called the end times. And with COVID-19 and the vaccine arriving precisely at a political time when so many conservative Christians feel vulnerable and in danger of being controlled and forced to do things that they are unsure about. And we can see, for example, so much of the writing these days about our rights being taken away, our capacity to express ourselves, our capacity to feel safe within our churches, and not to say things that would be characterized as hateful and so on and so forth. There's a lot of frailty, there's a lot of sense of, just being persecuted and facing an uncertain future. So, you can understand why there's so much suspicion regarding whether to take the vaccine or not. Because of all these conspiratorial scenarios that we build for ourselves. So, we've mentioned the possibility of unwanted sterilization, unexpected biological alterations, an implanted chip, which is something, it sounds, ridiculous, but no, these are real concerns that would now allow people to be easily located, or being unable to buy goods or to travel unless they have taken the vaccine. Considerations like these, they weigh heavily on the hearts of many conservative believers. So my question here it is, how would you respond in order to quiet some of these fears and to reassure these believers that this vaccine is not some part of a larger plot to control and to oppress non-conforming Christians? I think, one of the issues, for example, maybe that whole thing of, I may not be able to go with the fear of people who have asked me, I may not be able to go to the supermarket and buy unless I've taken the vaccine. I may not be able to travel to see my daughter in Tennessee because, I don't have the certification of the vaccine. So, I think this idea of control, of being forced to do certain things that you may not feel at ease doing, it weighs heavily on the minds of many conservative believers, also related to the prophetic, to the highly spiritual, and so on and so forth. So maybe you can speak to that. I know that it's a kind of a heavy question, but feel free to do it. Take it as you want. I know, Dr. Chandler. Maybe we can begin with you, and you can, and then. But I'd also like to hear from Dr. Baden as well, just briefly.
Sure. Yes. I mean, people call me all the time with concern that, this is fulfilling Matthew 24. This is fulfilling Revelation, the plagues, the pestilences, rumors of wars. And these are uncertain times. It's not just the vaccine. People are in economic distress. There's been a lot of job losses, and people have gone through seeing a lot of brutality. I mean, there are many different issues that are bombarding people's minds. And so I can understand their fear of a vaccine. And in terms of not being able to travel, I know one lady called me, she said, look, if I have to take that vaccine to be able to travel, I just won't go. I don't want anything injected in me. However, it's important to look at it beyond a control issue as a means of protection from infection, protection from severe infection, protection from being hospitalized and losing, livelihood. And so it's important that it not be evaluated just from the perspective of it being recommended, but as a benefit, because we know that individuals that receive the vaccine, there's 94 to 95% efficacy, meaning in preventing the risk of developing symptomatic infection or severe infection requiring hospitalization. And if you've seen people that have been hospitalized with COVID, of course, you may not have been able to enter the hospital, but when they come back out of that hospital, they're often very weak. They're weak for days. I have friends that they haven't been able to work in a couple of months because they're still having difficulty getting out of bed. And, not everyone has that course, but unfortunately, Blacks and Latinx, their death rate is 3 times that of whites, and they're more likely to be hospitalized. So you have to weigh that with the concern that, this is end time. And we know that if it is end time, we're expecting Jesus to come soon. So there's also that hope. And we also have the encouragement, if we're going to go scriptural, that Jesus says, beloved, I desire above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health. And so he'll guide people in terms of making those decisions about whether to take the vaccine or not. But also remember that taking the vaccine is a good strategy of being in health. We know that it prevents infection, it prevents symptomatic infection, and prevents severe disease resulting in hospitalizations.
Thank you.
No, it's been a traumatic year for all of us. It's been very difficult. And I think, as Dr. Chandler said, not only COVID and this virus, but just the collapse of society, the isolation, we're on a Zoom instead of around a table together. That is very alienating. That's very lonely. Jobs have been lost, economic hardship, children can't go to school. It has been a disaster for all. And the Black and Latinx communities have been so disproportionately impacted. But as we think about where the vaccine fits into this, I want to think back 50 to 70 years, and some of our wiser, more experienced listeners may remember. Back in the 50s and 40s and 50s, their parents were afraid that they would go out and play and then get paralyzed. And we used to have large facilities of iron lungs for polio. And that's something that our more senior members, our wiser members, may remember. And vaccines help solve that problem, where when we see a case of measles or hear of a case of polio, it's on the news. Because we don't see that, at least not here. And so I think the simplicity of vaccines sometimes undermines the value that they bring. And as Dr. Chandler said, as Reverend Yardy said, we're having 200,000 to 300,000 new infections a day, 3,000 deaths a day. And then, as Paulette mentioned, the number of people who have the post-COVID long hauler complications that we're still understanding what that even is. These are just some of the consequences of uncontrolled COVID infection, which we're witnessing. And part of my getting vaccinated is also to protect my family. It's also to protect my community, because I'm less likely to bring it home to them and to the vulnerable people around me. And in the Commonwealth, about half of our deaths have been in our seniors. And our senior homes have been so devastated when COVID arrives and so many get sick and die, that part of at least my thinking is not only is it important for me, but how do I help protect those around me, and how do I help us try to get back to a place where we can actually see each other and touch each other again? Because I think that has also been a real tough part of the last year. So that I think that we don't know all the side effects. The side effects that we've seen so far have been fairly limited, and the likelihood of longer term side effects are quite unusual for vaccines. And in terms of issues of chips or other things being placed in it, I've never heard of that, of seeing that happening or any evidence of it. And so I think we need to listen to each other, to the concerns, and then double check to make sure that there aren't any ways to know if those concerns are true. But I've not seen or heard of any concerns of that nature being associated with the manufacturing or in the distribution or in our pharmacies when they're drawing up the syringes, or in our clinicians who look at the syringes and are giving it to our patients. This is like a vaccine, like the flu shot, like the other vaccines that we use.
Wanda, I can see on your face an expression that says, I want to make an interjection here. Please go ahead.
Well, I guess the interjection that I would make is these are the same questions that we are getting from employee groups at the hospital. And I have had the pleasure of accompanying a physician to have small conversations with our employees to hear their concerns and to address their concerns. And I think when people, so that's why this forum is so important, to be able to answer those questions, because these fears are out there. And if we don't address them, as we said, I sat in front in a small group of employees, and when I said 4,000 people are dying a day, someone just like, reared back, like, because it is unbelievable. And yet with this vaccine, and I got my first dose of the vaccine, with this vaccine, we have the ability to stop that. And I think that's what is important, but we have to hear people out. We have to be respectful in terms of listening to their concerns. And, it's interesting to that. I was just thinking about the issue of tracking, which I've heard people mention that. And I wonder how many people who are concerned about the tracking have cell phones, because if we really think about what tracks us, it's that device that we have in our, in our pockets, in our purse, that has lots of information on us, And so, but I understand the fear, and I understand and it's important. And I've seen people in these conversations that we've had with employees, when they hear and they consider, and then they have signed up. And that makes me realize that being respectful and listening goes a long way.
Okay. Dr. Wright, before we come to you, to your question, I know you have a question, and I wanna get your question on the table. But Dr. Miranda, there is a follow-up question, another question that you have, and Wanda just alluded to it. And I would like to have it placed on the table. I'd like for us to talk about it, because there is enormous concern out there right now among not only the church people, but other people, as to whether this is going to happen. Could you pose other question?
Yeah, let me try to simplify it a bit, because I think, when I hear the conversation, my question has grown a little more complex, even in the sense of, right now, I was just looking, but as a matter of fact, yesterday at a PBS documentary on vaccines in America and so on and so forth, beyond COVID. And I was fascinated by this sort of this imminent crash between conscience and individual freedom, and at the same time responsibility toward others, and the desire or the obligation not to contaminate others. So you have these two, sort of an immovable stone encountering an irresistible force. On the one hand, you have individuals who are very convicted about the fact, I don't need those vaccines, I don't want to take them, I'm fearful about them, my conscience doesn't allow me. My conscience should be respected. My religious conviction should be respected. And then you have another side, which is that other side that says, well, you don't live in an island. You live in a continent, and there are people all around you. Your conscience may affect others adversely and may bring death to them and bring disease. And therefore, you need to also be, I would say, controlled, but your conscience needs to be, hedged in by that consideration, that collective consideration. It has affected also churches that say the same thing. It says churches are autonomous. We are led by Jesus Christ. He's the head of the church. And we will not allow secular authorities to control the way we worship, when we worship, how many people can worship in our spaces, and so on and so forth. And the other side says, well, yes, but those people go outside, they go to work, and they go to school, and so on and so forth, and then they can also contaminate others. So we do have a right to, and again, what that does, it just increases the anxiety that many people feel about the fact that slowly our freedoms are being eroded by these sort of utilitarian considerations, and slowly they're being taken away from us. Again, which fits into this whole conspiratorial scenario of slowly, exactly what we have feared all along, but with a different script, it's actually being realized. Our rights are being encroached upon, they're being snipped at little by little. And what we have feared is exactly what has come upon us. And so, I think that there's a lot of that concern among people. So, the idea that I won't be able to take my child to school unless he gets the vaccine, and I am not ready for that. So I close by this, because I don't want to make a statement. I really want to leave it with a question just to stimulate discussion, is that I think this pastoral approach that you guys have mentioned in the last few minutes, this sort of, psychologically sensitive approach to people's concerns, their fears, and so on and so forth, I think is a good thing. Because if we tell people, well, listen, you're going to have to take your spinach, you're going to have to eat it, because it's just that. I think that can just make people more resistant, more scared, and in the end, we will produce the opposite effect. And so, that's really the kind of world that I'm pointing at right now. It's a zone more than anything else. And so, whatever reaction I can elicit from you, that would be great. And I think it's for the benefit of our listeners, of course. And if you have any thoughts, they don't have to address precisely the issue, but in that line. Well, I know maybe I didn't, it's a kind of a thorny issue.
Yeah. I understand. I hear people's concerns about what they feel as a lack of choices that they have, because they understand that they view that soon their employers are going to require that they have this vaccination. And they also feel that they shouldn't have to have masks. So it goes beyond the vaccine. It goes to wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask, not being able to congregate, in different large settings. So people do have these fears, but what we also have to look at is that we have the ability to shift these rules if we are vaccinated too, because if we are able to reduce the infection rate and the severity of disease that we're seeing now, we'll be able to go back to having our kids in school. We'll be able to go back to having large gatherings. So really, it's a short period of time where we have these types of guidelines in place. That's one perspective. And so if we think of it from the short-term perspective, then we can think, oh, well, this is part of the passage to having more freedom. Now, of course, long-term, you might think, okay, well, I still have to get that. The vaccine is recommended as part of the toolkit to get to the greener pastures. And that's the balance.
Now you can see why in the church, people with a biblical worldview believe that this vaccine has something to do with the end times and with the mark of the beast. Because with other vaccines, there was not a stipulation you cannot travel on a plane. But we are told that this is where this is leading. Your children cannot go to school unless they have the vaccine. You're not going to be able to buy and sell unless you have the vaccine. Now we understand the importance of protecting other people from us, but we also understand, as Dr. Miranda was saying earlier, that is taking away our rights. It's taking away my rights. I want to be able to determine whether or not to take the vaccine and not be told you have to take it or else stay at home and don't come out of the house. Do you think that is where we are going? Are we headed in that direction?
Well, thankfully, we are all given the choice at this point of whether to take it. And I'll let Lindsay speak.
No, I think it's hard to know what politicians will do. I think that how do we, as part of our social contract with each other, figure out how do we take care of each other, work together to enable us to come together. And as Dr. Chandler said, it's a toolkit. It's a toolkit of when you're sick, You try not to interact with others, to share. It's not just COVID. There are many other viruses. It's respiratory etiquette, it's washing your hands, it's wearing a mask, it's vaccines, because there's a flu shot as well as a pertussis shot, and there's now the COVID shot. And so I think we as a community are going to have to look at how these different pieces fit together and fit together for the different circumstances. But I think getting our schools open is just so important for all of us to start to get back to normality and start to have jobs and make money and be able to get out of some of the economic hardship. Being able to vaccinate our senior centers so that we're not having our hospitals full of very, very sick people that then make it harder to get the rest of care, let alone the seriousness of illness in certain circumstances. So I don't think, Reverend Yardy, that there's a rule that's going to come down. I think it's going to be an ongoing conversation where we hear each other, we understand the different tools and where they fit in, because I think July is a different kind of month of transmission than January, just based upon how viruses circulate and how we spend more time in closed doors as opposed to outdoors. So that we'll have to use the different tools that we have, including seasonality, to be able to start to get back to normal. What I think we all want is to figure out how to get back to normal so we can be interacting in a more normal way that is healthy, that doesn't put each other at risk, and uses all the different tools that can help us get there. And part of the reason the vaccines are exciting for many is just how well they work. It's a single or two shots, and the protection is very high for months, hopefully for years. We don't know. That gets back to Reverend Wright, your comments. We don't know how long it lasts because we haven't had this problem for years. We've had this problem for months. So we'll have to continue to study it, to learn from each other, and to improve what we do. But I don't think there are going to be mandates that say you must do blank or blank. I think it'll be an ongoing conversation or it won't work.
Okay. Now, Dr. Wright, you move among so many leaders, so many pastors in the Black communities here in Massachusetts. You hear their concerns. I would like to give you some time to express some of those concerns and ask some of those questions, because that's a community where there is a lot of hesitation. Now, I must say, in saying that, I have had pastors of predominantly white and some all white churches say to me, we're not taking the vaccine. So it's not just among the Black the Black communities. So, but I love to give you some time to express some of those concerns.
Sure. And let me give just a little context. I won't take long with this. I have regular meetings with pastors, mostly in the Boston-ish area, but certainly as far south as Weymouth, as far north as Methuen. And we talk about this because we really do want to make sure that our people have the best information to make the best decision for them. One of the questions that has come up is something you've addressed, but I'd like you to go just a little bit deeper, which is the vaccine doesn't prevent you from getting infection, as I understand it. It prevents you from getting the sort of worst symptoms of the infection. Now, I could have that completely wrong, so I would really appreciate it if you could explain that in a way that, you know, somebody who's not a doctor, pastor, can understand it and then be able to explain to their congregation.
What the studies have shown, and these are two large studies with 30,000, 44,000 people, is that the vaccine, this kind of vaccine, prevents people from getting sick from COVID by 95%. And that's a little bit sick as well as very sick. the other part of this, which is a nuance, but you're absolutely right to raise it, is does it prevent you from getting COVID at all? And those data are not available yet. So we can't, I think it does, but we don't actually have the data to be able to say that it does. Those studies are ongoing because they take longer, because it's harder to assess someone who never had a symptom as to whether or not they had COVID but never had a symptom. And that requires blood tests, as opposed to you became sick with a cold, with a headache, with fever, you're laid up in bed for days, having trouble breathing, then it's easier to diagnose COVID because you have symptoms. So the data are pretty strong that it prevents you from getting symptoms that make you sick. The other investigations are ongoing, but we don't know for certain yet.
One last asterisk before we leave this subject, and I think it speaks to this thing over the past months of the COVID-19. I've been over and over again frustrated and even angry at the fact that whenever there is an element of hope introduced into the whole scenery, some scientific Grinch comes around and tells us that no, it's not that easy. And here's the sinister side of this conversation. And over again, you see hope sort of wrenched away from you. And with the vaccine, it was like that. I remember the days in the beginning of this whole situation where, we spoke of people even wearing badges, identifying them as having had COVID, so that now they could be certified as able to work and be totally inoffensive, to the rest of people. They can't get COVID, they can't give it, and so on and so forth. That was taken away from us. And the vaccine also is the same thing to a certain degree. We were told you take the vaccine and that's it. You're safe and no problem there. You can't be contagious to others as well. But now the conversation has become more complicated as well. And now it is the fact that maybe, you may not have COVID, but you could still give it to somebody, or the length of time. Maybe it's just 4 months, 5 months. And it's not, much longer than that. So we have all of this, this animus generated, all this conflict and all of this urgency and so on and so forth, to have a product that may, people say, well, it may only be for 4 months and then that's it. And you still have to wear your mask. That's the other part. And you may have to wear your mask for the rest of your life or whatever it is. So I think, that's one thing that really frustrates me a bit. And maybe you can just speak to, I'm sure I'm not the only one to that.
Reverend Miranda, you're right. I'm sorry, I'm a Grinch. And the Grinch of COVID hurt so many people in December and over the holidays as things were emerging to guide us as to how to bring back health or prevent illness. And it's really hard. It's hard because we don't have all the answers. And not having the answers is very frustrating. It's scary. It's uncertain. It raises more questions. And that's really hard. But I want to be careful that we don't make up answers because we want them. And that's where we try to have a careful process to try to get it right and not just quickly. And I think you're probably right that the vaccines will prevent people from getting infected and prevent people from infecting others. We just haven't been able to do the science long enough yet to show that, to do it carefully with all the independent review that we talked about earlier. And I guess I'm sad that I'm a Grinch, and I will try to do better as we figure out how to generate the answers that we can all have confidence in.
I appreciate your honesty. Thank you. That helps a lot.
Yeah, and can I just say something on that? It's been one of the big challenges for us as an employer, because the word that we've been using in leadership is that all of this is so fluid and it's changing all the time that it's hard to communicate because things are evolving quickly. And that's both good because, we've gotten the vaccine relatively quickly, but this is a dynamic situation. And I think that people are longing for something that looks more certain. And so we really try to constantly communicate, and also, be sure to say that this is what we know now. And as we know more, we'll communicate that as well.
Dr. Wright, I want to come back to you because you are part of a church community. You are the assistant pastor of a large church in Boston, one of the oldest but large and thriving churches in Boston, where the congregation or the makeup of the congregation is predominantly seniors. What are some of the concerns that you hear among the seniors there? And because you interact with all the other churches so much, what are concerns in the other churches among the seniors?
Well, the questions among the seniors actually reflect some of the questions that other people have. For example, if people have other chronic conditions or issues, is it safe for them to take the vaccine? Will this in some way have an impact or cause something to flare up? So that's one of the questions that's really been raised. And let me throw this out, the next question out. It's not directly related to this, but I think it has an impact on how people are thinking about this. They keep hearing this term herd immunity, and they're not sure what that means. And they're not sure how that affects whether they take the vaccine or not. So if you could address, how any underlying conditions may be affected by the vaccine, and then just sort of explain this concept of herd immunity and why taking the vaccine helps, or what that dynamic is, I'd really appreciate that.
So in the large studies, over a quarter of those who participated were seniors, and they had all the conditions that we get as we get older, and flaring of conditions was not seen. So there's no reason to believe that this should cause conditions to flare, and we haven't seen it in the well-done, well-controlled studies. And then as this is being rolled out in the larger community, that's something that is ongoing surveillance to see if there are any patterns. But we've not seen that, and seniors with multiple medical conditions were part of the people in the study, because the vaccine needs to be available to the people who need it most, which includes that group in particular. The other question was herd immunity. Yes. So the concept of herd immunity is, think of when I get infected with a virus, lots of virus replicates in me and I spread it to the people around me. So if you have 10 people who have no immunity and one of them gets infected, then the others all get infected. If 9 out of those 10 people have immunity, so they're protected against the virus, then it's very hard for the virus to take hold. And then it can't come into that group because there's no way in, because the other members of the community are immune, they're protected. The virus can't get a foothold and replicate and go to the next person. So by having many of us vaccinated or having had infection, so we have immunity, then it is much less likely for others to get it because it's hard for the virus to take hold. The question is, how many of us need to have immunity to have that level of protection? We've heard 70%, 80%, 90%. It depends a bit on how easily the virus is spread. And there are situations like some countries that are rapidly vaccinating their entire populations, and we're watching their hospitalizations plummet and the new cases plummet, meaning so many fewer people are getting seriously ill or getting ill. And that is the evidence of herd immunity. And we'll see that as the countries get completely vaccinated. And that's really important because there are some members of our community who can't be vaccinated, or where vaccines may not work, such as our cancer patients getting chemotherapy, or other patients who have a very, very weakened immune system because of illness or care. And so there, a vaccine may not work, or they may not be able to get a vaccine. And it's even more important for those of us around them to be protected so they don't get sick. And that's the concept of the herd, or the rest of us don't amplify or spread the virus so the vulnerable don't acquire it. But whether it's 80%, 90%, 70% that of the community, that's something we'll figure out, but it's probably going to be in that range because this is a very transmissible virus, as we've all witnessed.
Now, there's much discussion about different strains of the virus. If I take the vaccine now, can a stronger strain of the virus affect me? I think there are a lot of people who are concerned about this.
I think all of us are concerned about this, in that the virus is not passive. It is figuring out how to get smarter to be successful and to get around the medicines or the other treatments, including the vaccine or the immune responses. So so the virus is changing all the time. However, it's unclear if those changes get around the immune response, because our immune system is pretty smart. And we deal with infections all the time, and those infections try to get around our immune system, and our immune system gets stronger and fights off those infections. But that is something we're going to have to closely monitor, are there any variants that wind up getting around our immune system, and then do we need to give a booster shot or something else to make the immune system that much stronger so the variants don't get around it? And that's not happened, but that is something that we have to watch carefully. And as Wanda said, everything changes because this is very fluid. So we'll have to continue to monitor that and respond thoughtfully.
And also remember that as the virus replicates, as it multiplies, that's when it mutates. The more the virus is able to multiply, the more mutations you get. So that's why we want to halt the spread of the virus. And one way we do that is through, it's vaccination. Because if I'm symptomatic and coughing, I'm spreading. Yeah, or if I'm in the hospital and I'm very sick, I run the risk of spreading it to, the hospital staff, or even, you can think about it. We don't have evidence that, it blocks transmission directly, but you can think of it how indirectly, if you're going around sick, asymptomatic, you may be asymptomatic, but you're still spreading it. So when you spread it, it's multiplying, it's running the risk of mutating. And so we have more risk of developing all these different variants that may develop resistance to the vaccine.
Now, there are some people listening to us right now, to this discussion, and they believe they have received enough information that they would like to go ahead and take the vaccine. What do they do? Where do they go?
Basil, let me jump onto that, because this might be a question. Certainly it's a question for a lot of people in our community, especially those who are undocumented. What kind of information would be required of them when they go to take the vaccine?
Currently, if someone goes to get vaccinated, they register their online sites that they're registering to receive the vaccine. And if they have healthcare, they're registering, they may be registering at their site. But currently, you don't have to show a driver's license or a social security card. You just provide a name. And of course, you may provide some information so they can contact you to remind you about the second dose, because the vaccines that are currently approved, the Pfizer and Moderna, require 2 doses. Alternatively, they give you a card with that second dose, date, time that you're supposed to show up, and that's it. So you can show up, you just provide your name, they vaccinate, they give you the card, you show up again for your second dose. So currently there's no, ID required for the vaccinations in Massachusetts. I know other states, they are thinking about how to require different identification to prevent people from coming in from other states with the vaccine.
Okay, so you have been listening to the Brigham and Women's Pastors Roundtable discussing the matter of the coronavirus vaccine. With us tonight was Dr. Roberto Miranda, pastor of Congregational Lion of Judah in Boston, Reverend Dr. David Wright, Executive Director of Black Ministerial Alliance and Assistant Pastor at People's Baptist Church in Boston, and myself, Reverend Basil Yard, Director of Church Relations for Salem Media Boston and Senior Pastor of the Final Thrust Church in Brockton. Answering the questions or responding to concerns were Dr. Paulette Chandler and Dr. Lindsay Baden and Wanda McLean of Brigham and Women's Hospital. I want to thank you, pastors and doctors, for taking your time to inform our listeners and viewers. And to our listeners and viewers, we hope that you have received enough information that you can make an informed and intelligent decision about your own health and about the health of your families as it relates to the COVID-19 vaccine. Again, thank you for being part of this discussion.
Thank you all. It's a real privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.